Order. The House and Committee resumes its consideration of the Social Security Benefit Categories and Work Focus Amendment Bill. And the question is that clauses 1 to 3 stand part. Seeking call. Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to take another call on this bill. I believe this is the final stage of debate for the committee stages. And so I'll take this opportunity to, I agree with the member Ruth Dyson that it seems like it's been a rather swift debate. There was certainly eagerness on this side of the House to continue discussing not least some of the excellent amendments put forward by the Labour Party. We might have a chance to just at least reference them again, Mr. Chair, because not all of them were spoken to and there is some relevancy to them around commencement dates in particular. But at this stage of the debate, as tradition has it that we often use this opportunity to talk about how we might alternatively refer to this piece of legislation. And for those watching, they'll see the little ticker tape. They'll know that this is formally known as the Social Security Benefit Categories and Work Focus Amendment Bill. But some of our contention on this side of the House has been that the historic architects of the Social Security Bill probably meant for the system to be something quite different than it is today. And it's almost ironic, Mr. Chair, that we are debating this bill in the 75th year or the anniversary of the Social Security Act in New Zealand. You know, it was brought in at a time where, not unlike today, there were hard economic times, and the Labour government at that time wanted to move away from this notion of the deserving and the undeserving poor. They wanted to create an egalitarian society where no matter what circumstances that you encountered, you were able to find some kind of support, that you were able to live with a certain degree of dignity until such time as you were able to support yourself once more. And whilst the Minister is entrenched in here these things called social obligations, which by their very nature imply that people who are on Social Security aren't fulfilling some of these obligations, which speak to the basic needs of their own children, in many ways Social Security has always had a sense of obligation attached to it because it's a social contract. It says that as a citizen of New Zealand, you have a certain expectation that you can be supported, that there is no such notion as the deserving and undeserving poor, but that in return, as soon as you are able, you too contribute back into the common good, as it were, into the net, the pool that contributes to the social security system. So, are we still fulfilling that notion and that ideal in this bill today? Does it deserve to be called the Social Security Benefit Categories and Work Focus Amendment Bill? We would contend no. We would contend also that the notion of putting work focus into the title implies that work has not always been the focus of our social security system. Indeed, it has. In fact, if a government were truly dedicated to the notion of a dignified system that enabled people to transition back into the workplace, their first port of call would be that workplace, would be ensuring that those jobs are available, as we have always contended, would be for those who are, for instance, find themselves with a disability, ensuring that our employers are better placed to employ some of those individuals who do have some barriers to work. And as CCS Disability Action and IHC pointed out, so many of the groups they work with desperately want to get into the workforce. But the work focus from the employer's end, from their perspective, is what needs to be addressed. So we would contend that this is a mistitled bill. However, benefit categories probably is the one notion that, in its simplest form, is quite correct. This bill does merge together the categories of the Social Security Bill, and we've already traversed the different outcomes of that. I would, though, Mr. Speaker, like to refer to whether or not, in its most simplistic form, this bill would be better titled as the Drug Testing Warrants for Arrest and Bad Parenting Bill, because those are probably, that was the Drug Testing Warrants for Arrest and Bad Parenting Bill, because those are the notions within this bill that probably the public are most familiar with. If you said to them, have you heard of the government's welfare reforms, those are the bits that would be most well known. In fact, the drug testing in particular, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, because that was actually announced on 3 occasions. I went back just to check. First by Bill English, to be fair to the Minister. But if this was genuinely a bill that was about addressing issues of drug dependency, perhaps we might have paid more attention to what the Drug Foundation, expertise in their field, had to say on this bill. And for the purposes of, Mr Chair, for the purposes of further exploring whether that would be a more accurate title for this bill, let's go back to their submission. And I think they really summed it up quite well. They said the Drug Foundation supports measures to prevent drug use or dependence from being a barrier to employment. We absolutely agree with them, of course. No one in this House is ever going to stand up and say, if drug dependence is a barrier to work, or indeed drug dependence exists, that we should ignore that. Paid employment can reduce recreational alcohol and drug use and make a significant contribution to successful recovery from substance dependence. They go on to say, though, our concern is that if the details of drug testing and sanctions regime are not well thought through, they may ultimately do more harm than good. They go on to note the Ministry of Health's strong advice that that may indeed be the outcome of the drug testing regime included in this bill. They go further. They say drug tests are a blunt instrument. They fail to differentiate between recreational substance use and problematic substance use. As such, an occasional cannabis user could test positive despite their drug use having taken place more than 1 week ago, outside of work hours, and having no bearing on current workplace safety or productivity. Now, that point's an interesting one, because what they were trying to point out was that a blanket regime that then says that if you are a recreational user, then we'll apply a sanction. If you're dependent, though, we might let you go on to a different benefit category. We won't sanction you. You can go on to some other form of benefit which doesn't then penalise you. Well, that naturally creates the incentive to shift on to a different category. The flow-on is that you're then treated in the system for a dependency you may not in fact have. And you're treated in a system that is already choked. We have up to 6 weeks worth of waiting lists in some of our areas around genuine drug and alcohol dependence issues. So, are we creating a perverse incentive to declare dependence where dependence doesn't exist? I think it's a fair question, and it wasn't one that was adequately answered through this process. Coming back, though, Mr Speaker, to the other options that this bill could be titled, I heard on that side of the House the line, jobs are the best route out of poverty. Not going to argue on this side of the House, but that requires there to be a couple of jobs around for someone to move into. Just on the other side of that argument, jobs are in fact important for that sentence to actually be able to become a reality. Plus, we need to acknowledge that for sole parents in particular, there will be a period of time in which work is simply not the best option for them or their child, when their child is first born, when they're in its infancy. So then what? What is the best route out of poverty? So we've got to take into account the many and varied situations which this bill will be covering. So perhaps then, given the job argument, we should just call it the Ghost Jobs Bill, because we don't seem to have at any point really discussed the context in which this bill is operating, other than on this side of the House. Mr Speaker, if this bill had had a greater focus on children, we may have been able to imply that it had their interests at heart in the title. But as the Children's Commissioner pointed out in their really useful submission, one simple little amendment to this bill could have got around some of the concerns we had about the way that sanctions would be used and the impact that would have on child poverty, further exacerbating it. And that was the suggestion where he said, I'm firmly of the view that all decisions made through the social security system that directly or indirectly impact upon a child or children should be required to formally consider their welfare and best interests as primary consideration. Who could be against that? And yet that suggestion was not picked up. Mr Chair, I want to come to the commencement of this bill, which will come into force on the 15th of July 2013. One of the recommendations, however, from the Labour Party has been that, given we don't know the details, and the Minister claims that these are being worked through with the sector, and I'm pleased that the sector is involved, but surely we should have a little more transparency than that. So one of our suggestions is that before that commencement date kicks in, that we as a parliament have the opportunity to debate the final provisions of that policy. I accept that it's not a policy that requires legislative change, but I think that it's only a fair suggestion, given the amount of public interest there is in that element of the wider policy, that we have the ability to discuss it as parliamentarians. Now, that's a relatively simple suggestion. It doesn't change the substance of the bill, but it does give heed to democracy.
Rajan Prasad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to take what no doubt will be my final call on the committee stages.